welcome to episode 111 of Concussion Talk Podcast. I'm with Dr. Uzma Samadani, and before we actually get talking, and let Dr. Samadani introduce herself, I would like to first thank my sponsor, HeadCheck Health. Concussion Talk Podcast is presented by HeadCheck Health. HeadCheck Health bridges the gaps in concussion care through simple, powerful technology. Join organizations like the Canadian Football League, Track Factory Racing, the Canadian Junior Hockey League, Eastern Washington University, and Volleyball Canada, who rely on HeadCheck Health to improve communication and optimize care. Visit headcheckhealth.com for more. And also, I would like I'd be remiss not to remind you to please follow me on social media at Concussion Doc on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and on Good Pods, just Concussion Talk, and follow me and subscribe, rate, and review on wherever you get your podcasts, whether it's Apple, YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, Stitcher, SoundCloud, anywhere you get podcasts, Podbean, wherever you get your podcasts. But so I'd like to introduce Dr. Uzma Samadani, and I really hope actually before we started recording, if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but I want to make sure that you obviously know say it better than I do. But the brief intro that I have for you now, because you're assistant senator over a long one, you have a lot of accolades for your robust research in brain injury and your neurosurgery accolades as well. But Dr. Samadani is a neurosurgeon and brain injury researcher at the University of Minnesota. She's associate professor in the Department of Bioinformatics and Computational Biology at the University of Minnesota with the graduate faculty appointment in neuroscience. She's also attending neurosurgeon at the Minneapolis Veterans Administration Medical Center and founder of the neurodiagnostic startup Oculogica, which we'll get into more now, more after Dr. Samadani introduces herself. So I'm sure I know I didn't do you justice in all the accolades you've received, but please just introduce yourself further, if you would, please.
No, you absolutely nailed it. That's exactly who I am. I'm a neurosurgeon. I'm a brain injury researcher. I've been doing both for about, if you include residency, 21 years. Post-residency, it's 14 years, 15 years at this point. And I work at the University of Minnesota on my research. I do my research based out of the Minneapolis VA healthcare system. And then I also am in private practice as a neurosurgeon. So I directly take care of patients and I continue to work on mostly objective measures for brain injury, but also algorithmic treatments for brain injury and spinal cord injury.
Well, that's very appropriate. But actually, just by happenstance, that last week we had Dr. Adrian Cohen from Australia and talk about, again, another objective EEG, purple EEG diagnostic of a concussion and brain injury. And that was also his big thing was being it's objective and same with Oculogica, which before I should have mentioned earlier that I would encourage anyone to check out Dr. Samadani's TED Talk, TED Med Talk, whatever the correct way to say it, TED Med or TED Talk, about this brain injury, this Oculogica and ocular motility, eye movement, and how it applies to a brain injury diagnosis. Or a concussion diagnosis. So if you could please just guess just the basics of you explain your TED Talk, how you got into it, how you found this, why you started this company, and your research in brain injury.
So let me go back to the very beginning. Back in 2010, I was setting up my clinical practice and my research, and we were doing a clinical trial to look at an intervention that would improve outcomes after brain injury. And we needed an outcome measure. And we came up with the idea of using eye tracking. And our hypothesis was that people who were brain injured would not be able to watch TV as well as someone who was not brain injured. So in other words, they wouldn't be able to follow activity on a computer screen or a viewing monitor. And so that was the underlying premise of our whole idea. And so we came up with an eye tracking algorithm. And then what we found, and this was somewhat, it was not unexpected because it makes sense. But at the time, it was sort of a little bit of a big deal because no one had ever quantitated it. What we found was that people who are brain injured are not capable of moving their eyes in the same way as people who are not brain injured. And what happens is that they have restrictions in not only movement, but also in coordination. Yes. And particularly those restrictions in coordination are something that we can detect when we map the pupil position over time. And so that's what we're doing. So we look at the Cartesian coordinates, X, Y. It's sort of that third grade math that we all remember, when you plot out X, Y. So we look at the Cartesian coordinates of the pupils over time in people who are injured versus not injured, and we see differences. And where we see those differences are in specific pathways. So the pathways in the brain that coordinate horizontal movement or that coordinate vertical movement. And the interesting thing is that there are different pathways in the brain that coordinate movements depending on which direction you're moving your eyes in. So if you're moving your eyes up, it's a different set of pathways. And if you're moving your eyes down, it's a different set. And so we can actually map where in the brain the injury has occurred by looking at the metrics that are disrupted during the eye tracking. Right. And so we do this by mapping pupil position over 220 seconds. So we measure the pupil position at 500 times per second over 220 seconds. And then that gives us some sense of how well a person is capable of moving their eyes. And that tells us a lot about brain injury.
So why 2 minutes? Well, 2 minutes and 40 seconds is 220 seconds. So why is it 3 minutes? Sorry, 3 minutes and 40 seconds. So why is that time so important?
Well, actually, it's not. We can do it in much less. But that's what we started with in our research, and then we validated our data set. And that's what we submitted to the FDA. So that's what we're FDA cleared for. We are working on reducing it. So, Oculogica will eventually get it down to much less time because it's possible to tell a lot about pupil movement. The more you collect data, the more you can be sure that something you're seeing is not an artifact. So, having that extra buffer of time does give us some confidence in our results.
Because actually, I was obviously researching a bit before this, our talk about Oculogica, and also just talking about your, as I mentioned very briefly, your robust brain injury research, which is, you've been noted in your research has been noted in New York Times, Wired, and many others of the publications. And one of the ones I actually read, not the whole thing, but I read obviously the abstract and the intro and some of the methods and the conclusions of your own paper about, which is kind of very, very appropriate to me, cranial nerves 3 and 6, about, because I have a double vision, which is also known as diplopia, and you wrote a paper about that, and this may be very greedy to people who don't want to know about my specific brain injuries or my specific problem, but so why is I've been told that I may have or I may have, but I've been told by people, because I'm also a standardized patient, that they help the students at med school here in Newfoundland, in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada, and they do well, you said in your TED Talk, the finger thing, the eye tracking with their finger, and and so they do that, and the doctor note that I have like they obviously quiz the students as to there, but the third and sixth cranial nerve palsy, and because my eyes don't track well, so just explain what that is, like why nerve 3 and 6.
Well, let me back up just a little
Yeah.
bit. The way the brain works is that we have these nerves that come out of the skull base, and they exit from the bottom side of the brain, and there are 12 of them, and they control functions that are sort of the five senses, I would say, and then everything that goes to the head, so the face and the head. And so there, like I said, there are 12 of them. The first one is for smell. The second one is vision. So that's cranial nerve 2. 3, 4, and 6 are all involved in moving the pupil. And they have nuclei that share information so that they coordinate pupil movement. And then cranial nerve 5 is sensation to your face. And it's also some motor movement in your muscles.
Trigeminal nerves?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And so, people have disruption of that. And then 7 is movement to the face. 8 is hearing and balance. So basically our technology assesses cranial nerves 2 through 7, because what we do is we measure the pupil reflex, which is cranial nerves 2 and 3. So we look at, when a light comes in front of your eyes, do both of your pupils constrict at the same rate and at the same speed? Because that's something that's mediated by cranial nerves 2 and 3. Then we also assess, 3, 4, and 6 are responsible for moving the pupil. And so because we're looking at pupil movement, we get 3, 4, and 6. And then finally, we get 5 and 7 because we also measure blink. So 5 is sensation to the cornea, which is the surface of the eye. And 7 is your ability to close your eyelid. And so when someone has disruption of that pathway, they may have an alteration in how quickly or how frequently they blink. And it also will assess whether the blinks are symmetric. Because both eyes should be doing things at the same time.
Yes.
So actually, our technology of the 12 cranial nerves, it assesses essentially almost half of them, really. Because we get 2, 3, 3, 4, 6, and then 5 and 7. So we get a good chunk of the cranial nerves.
Yeah.
And what's important about that is that each of these nerves, it not only shares information with the other nerves in the brainstem, but also gets information from other parts of the brain through large pathways and networks. So, for example, something like vision, you choose where you look, right? But you don't choose the fact that your eye movements are coordinated when you look in that particular direction. That's something that happens in your brainstem. And when something happens in your brainstem, you don't think about it. There's no cortical input, right? And what that means is that this is not something that you can fake. You can't pretend that your eyes are capable of moving together when they're not. Nor can you pretend that your eyes are incapable of moving together when they are. Right. So that is good because it completely eliminates the possibility of someone trying to malinger or someone trying to pretend that they're well when they are not well. And then the other part of this is that multiple pathways from cortical areas also feed in to these cranial nerves. So things like balance, obviously balance is a complex function. When you're balancing on a balance beam or when you're walking, you don't necessarily think about it all the time. You think about it sometimes, right? If you're balancing on a tightrope or a balance beam, you'd be thinking about it. But if you were just walking across the room, you wouldn't think about it. And what happens is you get cues. You get cues from your ears, where you have your vestibular apparatus. You get cues from your eyes that tell you about what the room is doing, and all of those cues feed into pathways, and those pathways are complex. They go through things like the cerebellum, where sort of the information is all put together, and that's what keeps you upright. And when someone has a brain injury, some of those pathways can be disrupted.
Yes.
And we can detect the ones that impact, basically cranial nerves 2 through 7.
Yeah.
So that's how our technology works.
Because I was actually going to ask you more about it's called iBox, is the concussion assessment tool. And I was going to ask you why, but you already answered why is no baseline testing necessarily needed for this, but you can just repeat what you said, like tell why no baseline testing is needed for this.
So we don't have to have baseline testing because the vast majority of people who are walking around in the world have eye movements that are coordinated at baseline.
Right.
You would be an exception because you had a prior brain injury and your eye movements are not coordinated.
No.
But I will tell you this, there's a difference in disruption between people who are acutely injured, like who just got injured, yesterday, versus people who are chronically injured. So you're what we call chronically injured because you were injured a long time ago.
Yeah.
So different metrics would be disrupted in those types of people.
And I guess the box, why it's called box, is it says it's a box score of the metrics. But is that correct? Is that why it's called box? But when also what are the box scores?
Yeah, well, we named it iBox. Basically, box stands for brain injury associated ocular motility disruption. But
like it's capitalized, it's all capitalized. Yes,
yeah, well, it's okay. But the eyes are moving sort of in a box type pattern during the assessment.
Yes.
So it looks a little bit like a box, and that's why we call it iBox. But I mean, essentially, you could do eye tracking even with natural stimuli, and you'd still be able to figure out if someone's disrupted. It's just a lot easier when you use a provocative stimulus that sort of asks the pupils to move in a particular pattern.
So I mean, again, I'm just being a bit greedy, selfish here, but again, back to the diplopia and my personal diplopia, but diplopia. So how does that? If I'm watching say a soccer game on TV, well, how do my eyes move differently than yours would say?
Because the pathways that coordinate your eye movements are disrupted, and that's why you've had the problems that you've had. And it may, in your particular case, my guess is it's probably not the nerve that was injured. It's probably the nucleus in the brainstem that feeds the nerve that was injured. I mean, I haven't seen your images, so I don't know exactly what was injured, but more frequently when someone has disruption of more than one cranial nerve like you do, it's because the nucleus that creates those nerves that that is the basis for where those nerves come from in the brainstem is disrupted. And that usually is what happens. Right.
So because I know they're having. They were having problems. I would have problems with my figuring out what was wrong with my eyes and why they weren't coordinating. And so that was a challenge. And of course, I was injured in 2003 when this was obviously not as Ranger is not. It's not really not understood now. It's a lot better now than it was in 2003. And but. You started go back to how long you've been doing brain injury research and practicing neurosurgery, but you said you were studying you came up with the Oculogica, this eye movement, why is it good diagnostic works because you're researching just ways to diagnose concussion or ways to diagnose brain injury. Boys, that's what your study was.
Well, no, when we originally invented this technology, we were planning on using it as an outcome measure for a clinical trial to see if an intervention improved outcomes after brain injury. Okay. And then we realized that it was such a good assessor of brain injury that it would be useful for many different contexts. So, and actually it is. We are currently FDA cleared for aid in the diagnosis of concussion. But because what we are is a monitor of cranial nerves 2 through 7, there's potential for other applications. So for example, one classic example that's really relevant right now is long COVID. Right. we know that the COVID virus has direct neurological effect. It infects neurons, it gets into neurons, and it disrupts the function. So many people who have COVID have disruption of specific cranial nerves. Most classically, cranial nerve 1, because they don't have any smell.
Right.
They don't have
Okay.
taste.
Is
Yeah.
that the same nerve, or is that?
No, that's a different cranial nerve.
Okay.
But basically they don't have the same, like some patients have tinnitus, which is cranial nerve 8.
Yeah.
Some patients do have ocular motility dysfunction, which is not as common with long COVID as some of the other cranial nerve palsies. But we know that so here's another neurologic disorder that potentially could be assessed with iBox technology. There are others. So multiple sclerosis classically affects, causes optic neuritis, affects cranial nerve 2. So we can pick that up with eye tracking. So there are a variety of disorders that we potentially have application for. We've just focused on brain injury because that's where the need is greatest right now.
Yes.
We could also be used, for example, for screening for stroke, because the stroke will affect many of the cranial nerves. Essentially anything that causes impairment of central nervous system function might be detectable by our technology, because so many different pathways feed into the cranial nerves that we can assess.
And James, obviously there's a lot of applications for this, and just COVID, obviously you can't just use it to diagnose something that's not cleared for. But I mean, this long COVID and MS and stroke all sounds like they're very closely related to. Well, I'm not sure what I don't know much about long COVID, but I've heard a lot about it. But yeah. Also, can you just go a bit more in depth about why? Like, what do you said the eyes movement of box? That's what I saw. What's called eye box to the brain injury ocular. What is the brain injury?
Brain injury associated ocular motility dysfunction.
Brain injury associated ocular motility dysfunction. But but the eyes move in a box. So what exactly do the eyes do? Like, how do you get these things to? How does your eye box work? Sorry, in the nitty-gritty, which is on your website, but of course I got you Oculogica.com. But otherwise, how would you describe how it works?
Well, basically what I would say is it's a camera that looks at the pupils, and then it measures the pupil position, and we use time as the sort of the x-axis. So, we measure the pupil position over time while a person views a monitor. And on that monitor, we play videos. So we can use music videos, we can use sports videos, we use a lot of Disney cartoons, basically anything that the person wants to watch. For athletes, we use a lot of football and sports. And what happens is the video, the music video or whatever it is, it plays inside an aperture, and the aperture moves around a screen. So it's completely non-invasive. It's basically like watching TV. So for little kids, it's very, very feasible. Often you have tests, neurologic tests that little kids don't want to participate in because, they don't necessarily want to sit still for a long time. But getting a kid to watch cartoons for 220 seconds is actually pretty easy.
Yes, it's going to be a problem. Yeah.
Yeah. What's interesting is when we first invented the technology, I brought my nieces and nephews in to try it out. And the very youngest we ever eye tracked anybody was at 11 months. And this was my nephew. And he was basically not allowed to watch much TV at home, so not a lot of screen time. No. And so when he got a chance to watch a Disney cartoon, he was pretty transfixed. Yeah. So it was very easy to eye track him. We are not FDA cleared down to 11 months. We are FDA cleared from 4 years on. But
is that because of just the way the FDA does that? Did you have to special permission to do that?
We'd have to present data. So we only have data going down to 4 years old. Right. We are collecting data on younger, And I think it would be interesting. Before the age of 1, some children still have, they're still sort of myelinating all their nerve roots. And so they haven't fully developed all of their coordinating pathways yet. And this is why sometimes when you see a newborn, it looks like almost like their eyes aren't completely, focused or fixed or coordinated.
Because they're not. Is that why?
Because they're not.
Okay.
And then as they develop, most children are able to fix a gaze pretty strongly by about 3-4 months.
Oh, yeah. Is that why they get kids at that age, like really when they stare, they have the lungs, they have a hard stare. They're just kind of practicing kind of inadvertently.
They're just absorbing things.
Yeah.
So I think it would be interesting to look at that age group, the very young age group with eye tracking. But, I would expect that it might be more technically challenging because their heads are smaller and, they can't really sit up. And, but, it's definitely an interesting idea because one could probably figure out exactly when their eye movements do become coordinated. My guess is it's probably before age 1 for most kids, because by then they're running around and they're able to balance, they're able to do all the skills that are developed in conjunction with eye movements. So we are FDA cleared down to age 4, but it's possible to eye track kids even younger. And the bottom line is that what I'm saying is this is an easy test. It's non-invasive. A tiny little kid can do it. It doesn't require education. It doesn't require literacy. It doesn't require, a cultural awareness of anything. It's completely agnostic to language or socioeconomic status.
Right.
And that in a sense makes it an equitable test.
Right.
Because you want to have a test that doesn't require someone to have a command of the English language, for example.
Right.
Because they may be
to know like when what day is and who the resident is and stuff like that. Like
well, you may have an educated person who speaks multiple languages, but they're not good at English, and then you give them a test in English and they don't do well.
Yeah.
So when people are assessing neurologic function, there's a tendency to ask patients to do volitional tasks. Right? Balance on one foot, right? That's a volitional task.
Yeah.
And the problem with volitional tasks is you can choose how well you want to balance, right? You can choose to throw yourself off balance because you have that capacity, right? So with any volitional task, it's harder to assess neurologic function.
I guess it also depends on your mood that day. If you're having a bad day, you're thinking of something else, you can't balance as well.
Yep, exactly. So, anger, hunger, fatigue, stress, anxiety, all of these things can affect tests of neurologic function if those tests are volitional. So we want to have a test that is, sort of as passive as possible. And, just putting a screen in front of someone, their eyes almost follow it automatically. And so that's the ideal scenario, is where you don't have to force someone or ask them to do something, but they do it sort of passively and automatically, and that increases validity of the test because it enables you to really assess things. When I say that we have a stimulus that moves around the screen and it plays videos, it plays movies, we can actually also assess you even if you don't follow the stimulus. Because suppose we've had patients who do this, who deliberately choose to, look somewhere else. Right. But even when they do that, their eye movements are coordinated, so we can tell if they're trying to malinger or not, because they still have coordinated eye movements or discoordinated eye movements, whatever the case may be.
So the data tells you that if their eyes are obviously just by looking at the eye, you can say, oh, this person's trying to move their eyes away or whatever. But as a general question, because I know you said in your TED Doc, your TED Med Doc, however you want to say that, that this was between 2 or 92, and that may have been just a well put together little analogy or not analogy, but anyway, way to say it. But so is there there's a part of your when your eyes coordinate? This is obviously a more general question, but there's an age when it's just there's after a certain age, you're just say it's not going to change much, or it's not, or just if someone's
Well, so we are currently FDA cleared for aid in the diagnosis of brain injury, or aid in the diagnosis of concussion, I should say, up to age 65. And the reason that we stopped there is that we don't have data for older patients.
Right.
What happens with older patients is that other factors start to go in. And when I say other factors, I mean things like, well, yeah, glaucoma, definitely. But, so ocular dysfunction in general, but also, the effect of age-related, mild cognitive impairment, dementia, other causes. And we have noticed that there are differences in eye movement tracking between people who are demented versus not demented. But we haven't published on that yet. And that's definitely something that we're seeing at the extremes of age. And so therefore we didn't submit, data on concussion in that patient population. What happens in the older patient population with brain injury is the older you get, the harder it is to recover from a brain injury.
Yeah.
A very trivial injury in a 70, 80, or 90-year-old is a big deal. When, if the same, like if you just bump your head at the age of 80 or 90, you can have a bleed on the surface of your brain, and it can be devastating.
Yeah.
That same bump to the head in a 10-year-old kid might not even be noticed. There are huge differences in capacity for recovery at older ages. And it's almost as if, a trivial injury is so much more of a cataclysmic event at that age group that it would be harder for us to say that an injury is mild when someone sustains an injury in that age group, relative to a younger person.
Right.
I don't really love the terms mild, moderate, and severe to describe brain injury, because I feel like they don't do an adequate job of classifying the nature of the problem. Someone can have a quote unquote mild brain injury and they have lifelong affliction. It disrupts their function for years. It keeps them from having a job. It keeps them from having, meaningful relationships. It can lead to addiction. It can create a death spiral. And, when, it increases your risk for suicidality. So literally a death spiral. And, so that's why I don't love the term mild traumatic brain injury. I think it's a bit of a misnomer.
And so I was going to give you a chance to talk more about oculogica, but it's one more question about this day. You say you don't like the term mild traumatic brain injury. So PCS, or some people say post-concussion syndrome, but now it's also persistent concussion syndrome. Persistent concussion symptoms. So which one do you like? Do you have a preference to those terms, or do you haven't thought that much?
Well, I use them. I use all of those terms because that's what is commonly accepted in the vernacular of our field. Exactly. But I feel as if sometimes we need to do a better job of classifying the physiology of brain injury. So, I think that the tricky thing about brain injury is it's a bit like a salad. It contains multiple ingredients. So there might be cortical spreading depolarizations. There might be, endocrine dysfunction. There might be diffuse axonal injury. There might be multiple different pathophysiologies that are all occurring in the same person, but to different extents. And we need to be able to classify the nature of injury. So just like we do with brain tumors or, cancer of any sort, is we classify it from a molecular perspective. And then we figure out exactly what's wrong and we treat the problem. And that's what we need to do with brain injury. And we're getting closer to being able to do that.
I've noticed so much improvement in the past, both 18 years since I've had my injury, but especially the last 10 years, have been just remarkable improvement in diagnosis and treatment. So,
so that's necessary, because once we can do that, it'll be a lot easier.
Right. And that will that I completely agree. And of course, just want to give you a chance now to talk more about oculogica and oculogica. What exactly is it, and what did you guys invent that led you to develop this, to found this company?
Yeah. So when I first realized that we had an eye tracking technology that informed regarding, brain function, my plan was initially to make it free and sort of put it on an open access platform, and anybody could use it and assess themselves, right?
Right.
The problem with that is that it would actually be difficult to use, because if hospitals cannot bill for it, then they're not going to utilize it. If a service is free for a hospital, they're not going to be able to bill a patient for it. And therefore, they're not going to use the technology. So I realized that unfortunately, my plan to give it away for free was not the best way to get the technology incorporated into modern medical care. In order to get the technology to be part of the care arsenal in the medical field, they have to be able to bill for it. And so my first thought was, oh, we should license it. But, the reality is that there aren't very many companies at that time, at least, that were interested in licensing a technology when there are no treatments for the pathology that it diagnoses.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
there's no treatment for concussion,
No.
Medtronic or Integra or Stryker, none of them are going to jump on a diagnostic
Just
when
take-
there's
yeah.
no therapeutic link to it, right? And so then we realized that what we had to do was we had to start a company, and the goal of the company would be to change the way we diagnose and define brain injury so that we can tailor therapeutics. And I
Very
think
much
that
concept.
it's the harder road, but it's the right thing to do, because the only way we can develop therapeutics for brain injury is if we can diagnose it in the first place. And so that was the reason that we started the company.
I think this actually it's very appropriate because you were just saying you started the company because of this research, the outcome you're studying. You were doing a study on outcomes for brain injury, and the company was created because you wanted to fund to for the outcomes. That's the only reason you started the company was the outcome to get this technology to anybody who will take it. We had to start the company first, but so where can people find this? Find out more about Oculogica. Where are you? Where's your website? Where can people find information?
Yeah, so we are in, I think, about a third of the states in the United States. We've got devices in, most big cities. Basically, if you are interested in finding a practitioner who will offer the testing, you can use the contact us feature on our website, and we'll put you in touch with someone who has an eye box. Most of the devices are in physician offices. They're not yet in emergency rooms, but they're in individual, either neurologists, rehab doctors, people who treat brain injury. They're in their offices, and that's where someone can get eye tracked.
And the website is oculogica.com, OCULOGICA.com.
Correct.
Yes, actually, before I was going to say that's it now. Before I got your bio, your profile, there's a long list of these. You're the chair of several neurosurgery groups, so academy associations and groups. So, is there any fewer that you were particularly? What would you think I should note that are particularly important? All important, I know, yes. But
one of the organizations that I will highlight is one that I've recently started working with, and I've joined the permanent council of, and that is the G4 Alliance. And the reason that I'm highlighting them is that they believe in advocating for care for the neglected patient. And by neglected patient, they mean people who don't have access to care. And that's something that I feel very strongly about. I feel that, healthcare should be available to everybody. It should be independent of your employment. Yes. And whether or not, you have, neurologic problems, none of that should impact whether or not you can access care, because people who already have problems need more care than people who don't have problems. So, I don't think that pre-existing conditions should preclude, access to further medical care. So, that's one of the organizations that I'm part of that I will highlight. Another one that I recently served as chair of the board for is called ThinkFirst, and they're an injury prevention foundation. They advocate for things like helmets and sort of paying attention to, how deep the water is before you dive. Like things that help with injury prevention. So distracted driving. They have a series of programs that basically span the lifespan. So it starts with babies and inflicted injury, goes all the way to seniors and falls, because falls are a huge cause of brain injury in the elderly. And essentially they have programs at every single level that help reduce brain injury. And I think that, as more awareness of the problem grows and people realize, hey, falls are a very common cause of brain injury, hopefully people will take measures to prevent falls. So, things that people can do to prevent falls, for example, in the ice, you wear, you can put they're called crampons or React tracks. You can put devices on your shoes so you don't slip. You can exercise your iliopsoas quads hamstrings so you don't fall.
I guess you're Minnesota. Yeah, I was going to say that. You guys are aware of this.
There are measures you can take. So I'm very involved in advocacy for brain injured people. And, I think that I'm proud of that work, and I'm happy to continue to try and amplify the voices of people in those fields.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast and talking about your new technology, and this hopefully spread to whoever needs it, no matter what their situation is but whoever can get access to it. And so again, thank you very much. And to find out more, just you go Oculogica.com.
Correct. Oculogica.com.
Page is where the best reach you,
yes.
reach out. Okay, and also on Twitter.
Yes.
At Oculogica, is it?
No, yes, at Oculogica, correct.
And I think Facebook and LinkedIn I saw as well.
Yes.
And that's just at Oculogica as well, I assume.
Yeah, exactly.
Search it there. But thank you so much, Dr. Samadani.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you very much.
The music at the beginning of this podcast is by Ben Sound. www.bensound.com.